So this is the new Mac Studio. And as the name suggests, it's designed for studios, for professionals, photographers, videographers, editing studios, the likes. And we are one of those, somewhere in the middle somewhere. We have a little bit of a studio here. And as every other YouTuber reviewer who's reviewed the Mac Studio would have told you, that this device is a good fit for that. But before we get into reviewing the actual product and the performance of the Mac Studio, I want to talk about our experience of buying these in India. This product is clearly targeted at professionals, and a lot of professional studios here are small businesses or startups or people who have been running a business for a while but are not scaling that big. So this is targeted towards that, a semi-professional, so to speak. And that person really benefits from one thing that the government provides, which is a GST input. Now, Apple made these available in India almost instantly after launch, which means that you could have bought this at the time of launch from the Apple website. And I'm assuming a few people did buy it from the Apple website, but a majority of people waited for the physical stores to get information on these, because I went on the launch day to a bunch of physical stores and they had no idea of the Mac Studio. Let alone the fact that getting this on CTO or custom to order from a physical store is practically impossible, and it takes up to 18 weeks for this product to get delivered. So not only can you not customize it from a physical store, it was not available immediately at the physical store. They had no information. You couldn't order one. It was a big mess. On the Apple website, you cannot claim GST input. So for a small business, that is something that is really crucial. The higher end Mac Studio, the amount of GST pays for a base model Mac Studio. And that is what Apple needs to understand. The kind of people they're targeting this product towards really need the GST input, and Apple should have that option on the Apple India website. A lot of people buying iPhones will benefit from this. A lot of people buying MacBooks and professional level editing machines like the Mac Studio and possibly the Mac Pro in the future will benefit from the GST input that people need in their businesses. And it was a big mess trying to get the Mac Studios that we did, but we've got them. And my rant about this whole situation is now over. So let's move on to talking about the product itself. Looking at the Mac Studio, what you see initially is that it looks like the Mac Mini. It's a larger version of the Mac Mini, and build quality and construction wise, it's quite similar. If you compare the Mac Studio with the M1 Max and the Mac Studio with the M1 Ultra, you will see that there is a considerable weight difference in both of these. And that's thanks to the fact that the M1 Max variant actually uses an aluminum heatsink or an aluminium heatsink, whereas the M1 Ultra version uses a copper heatsink, which is considerably heavier. So you see about a 1 kilogram weight difference between the two devices. This is not something that really should bother you in any way, but you should understand that there is definitely more heat generated by a bigger chip with more GPU cores, and hence the thermal performance of both of them is more or less identical, but this one needs a bigger heatsink and a much more efficient heatsink, and copper is definitely the material of choice for that. So in India, the Mac Studio starts at 1,90,000 rupees and goes up to almost 7,90,000 rupees if you get it fully loaded from Apple. Like I said, this is a CTO model, which means that you'll have to customize it and basically add on the additional storage, the additional RAM, and the higher GPU count in the M1 Ultra, and that will cost you somewhere in the 8 lakh rupee price bracket. Now, Apple has done something really interesting, and it's interesting for them, but really confusing for a lot of other people, is that the 27-inch iMac is now discontinued. And they want you to pick a Mac Studio with a Apple Studio display for that price. But the Studio display itself is 1,50,000 rupees. And if you go back a couple of years, you'll find that for about 180, you could buy a Apple iMac 27-inch, which included a 27-inch Studio display with the actual computer itself. So what you are actually seeing is that they've removed the panel, put it in a separate body, and they're going to charge you as much as an iMac for the display. So one big tendency that we usually have is to overpay for gear or get gear that we don't really need. And we are no stranger to that. In fact, I have overspent for gear for almost 10 years, and I've always had overpowered gear and computers and cameras and things like that. The reality is that the last time I upgraded my main editing machine, it was 2017 when I bought the iMac Pro. At that time, I paid for an 18-core CPU, which was overkill at the time. But the good thing is that it has lasted me till 2022, and while it is on its last legs as far as being an editing machine, you have to realize that it has served almost 5 years of pro-grade editing for us, and that does sort of justify the paying for the 18 cores at the beginning of buying it. Now, the same case is applicable for the Mac Studio, but only at a smaller level. Because in reality, if you compare it with, for example, the MacBook Pro, if you buy the 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Max, that is priced at roughly around 3,20,000 rupees. And for the same spec, you're paying only 1,89,000 rupees. So you can get the M1 Max variant of the Mac Studio for 1,89,000 rupees. If you don't need the portability, this is a much better value for money proposition. And why is it a much better value for money proposition, especially from an editing point of view, is that at least 90% of people who are going to buy the Mac Studio are actually going to find the performance of the M1 Max based variant really overpowered. And this machine is capable of handling most editing, rendering, and even video editing tasks, which is what most people will be buying this machine for, at least from a commercial consumption aspect. So when we ran our tests, we compared the M1 Max variant with the M1 Ultra variant. The Max variant is the base variant and the Ultra variant is the fully loaded one. And we saw that the performance uplift is not noticeable until you put a lot of load on the M1 Ultra. So for example, in a standard Final Cut export for a test file that we created, a 5-minute export took approximately the same time in exporting on the M1 Max as well as the M1 Ultra, which means that both these CPUs and GPU combinations were not stressed out in doing this export. It's only when we started exporting in 10-bit with HEVC, we started to see an advantage in the M1 Ultra, which gave us almost a 30-second savings in the export times. Bear in mind, the exports were actually real-time, in some cases faster than real-time, and unless those 30 seconds over a longer, much larger edit are going to be helpful to you, the M1 Max variant will basically solve all your needs, whether you're doing video exports or Blender renders or even graphic design. Even if you're doing any kind of animation, you'll find that the M1 Max variant, the one that you can buy off the shelf, is actually very capable and will solve all your needs. Only if you want to invest in a higher end machine and saving those precious 20-30 seconds every render, and if you're doing much larger files, those 30 seconds will convert into hours of savings. If that's worth it to you, you should definitely go spend that money. But like I said, the base variant is really overpowered, and for most people, just buying the thing off the shelf will be sufficient. Another thing you get to choose now is the fact that you can pick your own display. So you don't have to really go for the studio display. The studio display is a great option for those who need a combined display. For example, in India, you don't really get the LG 5K display, which was launched many years back. In fact, if you can find a unit here or there, they're still charging the full MRP that they were at the beginning of the launch of the display. So there is no alternative to the 5K studio display. There's also no display that gives you an integrated webcam or the kind of speakers that you get with the studio display. So all those things are really useful, but the price that you're paying for something like this is also really extreme. We've got the one with the nano texture, and this is excellent for video editing. So if you want to invest in a color corrected video editing or photo editing monitor, this one is a great option. And in that respect, it's not overpriced at all. In fact, some color corrected displays go for much higher than the studio display. And then you also have the Apple Pro Display XDR, which is a much more higher end option available. So if you're getting a studio display for those kind of things, then it's definitely worth the money. The studio display also has a built-in chip, and it'll also get its own firmware updates. You've also probably heard about the FaceTime camera not performing to spec, and Apple has released a beta update to fix this issue. And while it has improved the quality of the video a little bit, it's not fully fixed, and hopefully Apple can fix the video resolution and the quality of the FaceTime camera so that this becomes more usable. In our case, we're not going to be using the FaceTime camera as much, so it doesn't really matter. But if you are planning on buying the studio display for using it as a FaceTime and speaker-based device, you should be aware that at this moment, the FaceTime HD camera is not performing as it is supposed to. This is a sample from the FaceTime camera on the Mac Studio display. For the price of the studio display, you can actually pick up many monitors in the 4K resolution if you don't really care for the 5K 4K resolution. But one advantage that you do have with the display is that it fully works with Apple, and Apple recognizes their own hardware when you plug it into the Mac Studio. So you do get that seamless connectivity. It also has a built-in accelerometer. So if you do end up buying the one which does have the monitor arm mounting at the back, the VESA mounting, you can rotate it into a vertical position, and the device automatically recognizes that and switches the display so that you do get a vertical output. So that's a big advantage. So things just work seamlessly, but you are going to be paying for that convenience. And like I said, 4K monitors are relatively cheap now. Another thing that Apple has done is made the plugs in India as 15 amp plugs. Now this is a little bit of an inconvenience because you will need converters to run this off of your wall outlets if you don't have enough 16 amp or 15 amp wall outlets. And another issue is that if you do use UPSs, which a lot of people do use, those tend to usually not have 15 amp outputs. So again, you'll need to run converters to run the Mac Studio or the Studio Display off of a UPS. Another problem with this is that the Apple Studio Display does not have a removable power cord. If you are willing, you can go to the US, buy a cable, bring that to India, and then yank out the cable from the Studio Display and then replace it. It is possible, but it is not easy and it is not conveniently available. Another thing that you end up paying a lot for is the inbuilt storage on the Mac Studio. And while teardowns have shown that the storage is replaceable, it doesn't seem like you can install your own storage and format it as per Apple's requirements to start using or upgrading the storage later on. This might change in the future and people might come up with ways of installing your own SSDs in the Mac Studio. But for now, you do have a fast access Thunderbolt 4 ports for external storage, which is something that we are going to be using a lot. Or you can go for a model with a higher storage, which is inbuilt, and you do get Gen 4 SSDs in there, so you get really fast storage performance. In fact, if you're editing 8K video, this is highly recommended. And I would recommend that you go for the highest possible storage if you're doing anything that requires you to access storage quickly. Or alternatively, you could pick an enclosure with SSDs, and this connects via Thunderbolt and gives you 2700 Mbps of read speeds. It's not as fast as Apple's own SSDs, but it is a more redundant option. Plus, you can use it between other devices. And if these fail, they're actually easier to replace than Apple's own hardware. Plus, this costs almost 1/4 of what Apple charges for their SSDs. Now, whether you pick the M1 Max variant or the M1 Ultra variant, one thing is for sure, these things are more than what you need today. You're actually planning for the future when you buy the Mac Studio today, and it is more than capable of handling most of the tasks. And I've said this multiple times, if you are going to be using this for professional workflows, if you're going to be creating music with thousands of tracks, thousands of loops, then this is actually going to be the machine that you're going to want to choose. If this is the kind of power that we are seeing from these machines today, what is the expectation from the Mac Pro? We can only wait and watch, and that may be targeted towards more mainstream production studios, more like film creators. Right now, this is more a prosumer level machine, and it's actually really good value for money when it comes to giving you the performance for the kind of rupees you're spending for this. One other difference that you see between the M1 Max variant and the M1 Ultra variant is that the M1 Ultra variant gets 2 additional Thunderbolt ports on the front, whereas the M1 Max variant gets USB-C ports. If you have the kind of workflow that requires connections of lots of Thunderbolt devices, if you have portable drives, then the one with the Ultra is definitely more advantageous, and it also allows you to connect more displays via the Thunderbolt ports. As far as the Studio Display is concerned, it is basically the best 5K monitor that you can get, especially in India. The fact that it does have a camera and really good speakers is an added advantage. Here's a listen of all the kinds of speakers of Apple devices that we have to give you an idea. Now, as an alternative, you can also pick the 32-inch LG Ergo monitor. This is a 4K monitor, which has basically a really good color matched profile to the Apple Studio display. It is 4K, so you do have lesser resolution, but it is 32 inches, so you do get more screen real estate. Also, it has the added advantage of coming out of the box with an ergonomic stand, so you can tilt, swivel, rotate, raise height or lower height of the monitor as per your convenience, which is not available on the Apple Studio display, and you need to pay a lot more for just basically a height adjustment. Like I said, if you're interested in getting the Mac Studio and you do not need portability, this is actually a better option than the Apple MacBook Pro with the M1 Max. You pick the base variant of the Mac Studio and you're basically golden. In fact, it is quite portable if you think about it. All you need to do is have 2 monitors, 2 keyboards and 2 mice at different locations. If you're just moving between your home and your office, the Mac Studio is actually a really capable machine. Even with multiple streams of 4K video in Final Cut Pro, we didn't feel that the M1 Max was falling back. In fact, the fans didn't even ramp up once, which goes to show that there is a lot of potential left in the M1 Max, and we've not even scratched the surface of the M1 Ultra. Now, if Apple can fix their billing situation in India and make these things available to more people, and while they're at it, if they can launch Apple Pay as well, that'll be great. Thanks for watching, Apple. I'll see you guys in the next one.